everybody, and welcome to today's Strategic Farming Let's Talk Crops program. We're happy to have you joining us for today's session on promoting pollinators while still producing plenty. And these sessions are brought to you by the generous support from Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council and Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council, and of course are brought to you by the University of Minnesota Extension Crops team. And I'm Claire LeCan. And we want to welcome Dr. Dan Cariveau from the University of Minnesota Native Bee Lab.
Excellent. Well, thanks everyone for being here, and Claire and everyone, thanks for the invite. Today's going to be maybe a bit of a different talk than you've had in the past. I'm going to go over a little bit about bees in general, give you some kind of background in biology and the evolution and what bees are. And then I'm going to talk a bit about some work that we've been doing in eggland systems to really look at ways to benefit, in particular, our native pollinators. So to start off, I just want to mention that we're at the University of Minnesota on the St. Paul campus. We're part of the Department of Entomology, and we're located in what's called the Bee Lab. My lab is focused on a number of different things really related to our native pollinators. So we think of honeybee, when we think of bees, people often think of honeybees. These are really interesting, important organism. They produce honey, they do a lot of pollination, they're really important organisms. But my group studies the native bees. We have a colleague of mine, Marla Spivak, who is just recently retired, who's the honeybee expert. She's a world-renowned honeybee expert, and we're actually hiring a new honeybee person. So new things are happening in the lab. And I'm happy to answer questions about honeybees after, but I won't be talking about them in my talk. It's not totally our area. So we kind of focus on the native bees. And our lab does tons of different work related to native bees in terms of conservation, in terms of understanding their biology, and in terms of looking at things like ecosystem services and whatnot they play. So let's start off a little bit here talking about bees. I think bees are really cool. Obviously, I've dedicated my life to them. And they're an incredibly diverse group of organisms. Again, honeybees, that's one species, or there's kind of 9 different species, depending on how you want to talk about it in Asia and whatnot. But in the United States, we have this one species of honeybees, but in fact, there are 20,000 bee species globally. So they're an incredibly diverse group of insects. And as you can see here, they're really beautiful and they're just picturesque. They're really fun to talk about. A little bit about, I want to go over their brief history a bit. And this actually becomes relevant to promoting pollinators in general, and I'll share why at the end of this. But so bees have been around. A big question is, how long have bees kind of been around? Is something that people have asked. This is not work that our lab does, but colleagues of mine. And as you might think of, things like dinosaurs, they're big, they have bones, they preserve really well. But a big question is, when did bees kind of first come on the scene? We don't have a lot of good evidence of it because they don't make good fossils, but the fossils they do make are kind of the classic things if you remember from Jurassic Park. They go and collect resins from trees, and they get collected in tree resin, and then they get kind of preserved this way. The earliest known bee that we have is this bee here. It's kind of hard to see, but it's you can see there's the compound eye, there's a bit of an antenna there, and this is an amber, and this was actually found in New Jersey. This is the oldest bee that we know of, is found in New Jersey. And the other thing that's kind of neat here is they have this little structure called a corbicula that's being pointed to there. And that's an area that's on the back leg of bees. And in fact, we see this corbicula on honeybees. So you see that pollen packet there. That is where it's a shovel-like structure that honeybees and bumblebees use to put their pollen. Most bees don't have this, so only a kind of a subset of bees have this. And what's interesting is, if we look at this bee, this is a drawing of the bee, obviously. This bee, the Latin names are really informative. It's Critona prisca, and it's a kind of a neat name because Prisca just means ancient in Greek, but the genus, the first really complicated name there is stands for Crito, which is Cretaceous, and so this tells us that this bee was from the Cretaceous period, about 65 to 75 million years ago. So T-Rex was walking around at this time, for example, and in addition to that. They have that corbicula, which I just mentioned, and they're social bees. And so this is what this tells us from a bee biologist perspective. It says that this bee is very advanced, so it's not a very early bee. So the oldest bee that we have a fossil of is actually a much more advanced bee, telling us that the bees have been around for a lot longer than that 65 million years. And so some really nice work was done out of Cornell a while ago, trying to kind of document how old bees are. And so you can date the fossils at 65 million years. And then and we have other fossils too that are more recent than that. And you can look at the DNA, and the DNA actually in certain regions acts like a little clock and kind of ticks at a certain frequency. And so you can kind of like calibrate the clock and look at the different pieces of fossils. And what Sophie and Brian figured out is that bees kind of first appeared on Earth about 123 million years ago, so twice as old as the oldest fossil that we have. And what's interesting about this, because this is kind of cool, I mean, I love this stuff, but this is kind of interesting. But what's really kind of neat about this in my mind, and where this kind of brings it home to today, and it's going to be a theme throughout my talk, is there was something else happening on Earth at that time that was very consequential. So way before this, if you go to back 50 million years ago, we did not have flowers. And so about 150 million to 120 million years ago, flowers really started evolving on Earth. So most plants at that time did not have flowers at all. And so we see this rapid evolution of flowering plants. And so bees and flowers, and there's probably some coevolution that's been happening for this whole entire time, so that flowers are very diverse because they attract lots of pollinators. Bees are among the most important pollinators, and bees diversified with flowers. So bees, and the point here that I'm bringing home in this, in addition to kind of interesting prehistoric biology, is that that bees and flowers have been linked together, both groups, since they've been around. So bees and flowers are really critical to each other. So again, bees are really diverse. As I mentioned, there's at least 20,000 species that we have globally on Earth. And in Minnesota, we've been doing a lot of work. It actually takes a lot of work to figure this out, but we've documented pretty well the bees now throughout the state. In Minnesota alone, we have about 525 species of bees. That's kind of growing all the time. This is Dr. Zach Portman, who works in my lab. His whole job is basically to identify and figure out our bees. And so we just kind of published this paper a few years back, but this is the first big documentation of all the bees that we have in Minnesota. And again, honeybee is one species, and my lab kind of works on the 525 other species of bees. A couple other interesting facts, I guess, about bees that to kind of talk about, and this gets important. This will come back as it relates to things like habitat and whatnot, is that most bees nest in the ground. So most bees are ground nesting bees. We see a little Calides type of native bee up there. And so they nest in the ground. And we don't know much about native bee nesting habitat, but we know that nesting habitat is really vital. It's very difficult to find a bee's nest, especially these types of small little bees here. And if we look into a bee's nest, this is what it looks like. This is we see here that there's a hole in the ground, and then the bee has dug a little area there to basically, and made cells to lay her eggs. And so that big orange blob you see there is a bunch of pollen that she's been gathering. And then that little white thing is in fact the bee larva. So it just looks like a little worm or a little maggot there. So that the bee then lays its egg on top of that pollen ball. The egg hatches, and then that pollen is consumed by the larva. And most bees, about 80% of bees nest in the ground, but some bees will actually nest in cavities. Here we have little megachilid bee, and we see that it nests within hollow stems of plants. So they can nest in lots of hollow stems, and they put they make these various cavities in these stems. In addition to that, we think of bees and we think of honeybees again as being very social. And in fact, some of the most interesting biology in my mind is in fact the social systems of bees and of ants and bees, and honeybees in particular. Bumblebees are social, but 80% of bees are in fact solitary. So they don't have daughters that do help them out. One female basically does all the work. And the male's only job is, of course, to mate, but the female, most bees are totally solitary, and the females are the one gathering the pollen, laying the eggs, and doing all that stuff. And in fact, just kind of an interesting piece, we have more kleptoparasitic bees than we have social bees. What is a kleptoparasite? Kleptoparasites are these bees here. It kind of looks like a wasp. It's kind of looks a little aggressive. They're not very aggressive bees, at least to us. But what they do is they find other bees' nests and they lay their eggs on that little pollen ball, and their young hatch, and then they kill the offspring of the host bee, and then their offspring eat that pollen ball. So they're klepto, meaning they steal. They're parasites that steal the pollen. These are very interesting bees. We don't know very much about these bees. We don't think that they affect native bee populations at all. These are all native species, by the way. And we often think of bee communities that have lots of these parasitic bees as actually being really healthy, because they have lots of hosts to support them. So it's kind of an area that we're really interested in. Another type of parasitic bee, this is a really kind of a cool one in my mind. We have a social parasitic bees, and these are things that we find in bumblebees. And there are some of these bumblebee species, what they do is they will go to a colony of another bumblebee, a non-parasitic bumblebee, and the bumblebees are social. So they have most bumblebees have a queen, and they lay their daughter eggs, and the daughters help raise their sisters. So they're these highly social organisms. But what these bees do is they go around the colony and they kind of sit at the edge of the colony and they get all their scent all around them. And then they go into the colony and they kill the queen, and they basically make their daughters into the host queen's daughters into slaves and raise the offspring of the parasitic. So these are called social parasites. So they parasitize the social system of social bees. So not really relevant to all the crop stuff, but I just think it's a really kind of cool piece of biology. And one of the fun things about working with bees is their diversity, and that we really don't know a lot about bees. There's a lot. They're small. They move all around. They're actually very hard to identify, and so we're really at this cusp of really starting to understand this group of really interesting organisms. We work a lot with collections, so we collect these bees. We have to do that to identify them, and just some ideas on some of the unknowns. So the biggest bee on Earth is this bee called Megachile Pluto, and I'm sorry, it's called Wallace's giant bee, and that's a picture of me holding it. It's from the Cornell lab, and this bee was discovered by Alfred Russel Wallace in like 1860. He was a contemporary of Darwin, and it's the biggest bee on Earth. It's found in Indonesia, and it wasn't seen again until 1980. So almost 100 years, over 100 years later, was it refound, right? This is the biggest bee, and it took that long to kind of refine this bee. So we don't know very much about it. A colleague of mine is just one example. We're just discovering new species all the time. This is a colleague of mine who works up in Manitoba. He studies a group of bees. The genus is called Lasioglossum. And he's younger than I am. He's probably discovered 40 new species. And these species are common in in areas where there's lots of people. So one of the species is that he found is really common in Central Park in New York. And again, the genus is Lasioglossum, and then he got to name the species, and it's Lasioglossum gotham. My favorite bee name is one that he named is again, the genus is Lasioglossum, and then the species is awesome. So it's Lasioglossum is awesome. And Zach Portman, who I mentioned, is in my lab. has discovered lots of new different bee species as well. He works with these really tiny ones called the Perdita. These are these solitary bees that he's described about 10 new species of, most of which are in the desert Southwest. But anyway, so there's just a lot to learn. There's a lot of unknowns is kind of the point I want to get across. But now I want to come back to this original point, which I brought up before with even talking about bee evolution, is that bees are really diverse. They have these diverse lifestyles, diverse different pieces. But one of the things about them is that bees rely upon flowers for all of their life cycle. So the larva, which you see there on the left, that uses pollen and a little bit of nectar. And the adults, which you see there on the right, they use a lot of nectar and a little bit of pollen, but they're totally tied to flowers. So bees and flowers are totally tied together. And bees are really, and if you look at like structures of the bees, this is a hair of a honeybee, you see that it has these kind of branches to it. It's like a dead branch or something like that. Those branches are these kind of forked hairs, and that pollen just basically adheres to bees' hairs very well. And so bees are basically big sponge mops in terms of pollen. They just glom out of that pollen, just collects right onto them, and they're just very good at collecting this pollen, and then in turn pollinating lots of different plants. Excuse me. So a little bit too, I want to talk about just real briefly. We don't know very much about I get questions a lot in terms of like, how are the bees doing? How are bees doing? And when we talk about native bees, that's a tricky question. It's kind of like asking a botanist how plants are doing, or a ornithologist how birds are doing. For one, it depends on the bee species. For example, we have a bee here in Minnesota, the rusty patch bumblebee. And this bee, that green area that you see there, that used to be the range of this bumblebee. All throughout Maine and up into Canada, down into Tennessee. And this bee was once a relatively common bee, and now it's basically, especially from the East Coast, is all but extinct. Those little purple dots are the only spots that they've been found in the past 10 years in the East Coast. But you'll see a lot of dots in Wisconsin and Minnesota. This is one of the last strongholds of this species. So we know this species has really declined. We don't know a lot about other species because bees are in fact so hard to count. So what are the big things affecting bees? Well, lots of different aspects can have effects on bees. So bees are susceptible to pesticide. They're susceptible to climate change. But one of the big aspects disease that we think is a really big factor. But one of the things that we think is a big factor, and the thing that our lab really specializes on, is in fact habitat. So unlike honeybees, which are managed by humans, native bees need food. They need all these flowers, and they also need nesting resources and where to lay their eggs and do their nests, right? So the habitat is really, really important. And one of the main areas that we look at is how do we basically create and restore habitat for native bees. And so we do a lot of habitat restoration work in our lab. And so a big question we ask is, how can we most effectively implement and manage restorations? For one, restorations are really expensive. As you all know, purchasing or renting land is not cheap, so that takes a lot, right? Installing them, actually doing the work to put in the restoration, is also not cheap. The seeding, the prepping, and all of that sort of stuff. And then, of course, once you put this in, you all know this from farming, you have to manage those habitats as well. So we want to figure out and help land managers and private landowners figure out how to do this most effectively. And a lot of work has been done in this in terms of like habitat restoration, but a lot of it's been plant focused. And plants are, not that it's easy, but you basically take the seeds you want and put those in the ground. And that's really different. And a lot of times we're interested about how other organisms respond to that. And so we're really interested in what factors drive the success of these restorations, in particular, how it relates to bees, to native bees. We were interested in things like what bees benefit from restoration, and then what should we be measuring, or what are some of the goals of our restoration? So I want to highlight a little bit of this factors that might drive this success. And this gets into, we'll finally get into some of the research we do. A couple of things we're interested in is landscape. So what surrounds restorations? And this is really important because if you have native bees reside in habitats, in natural habitats or semi-natural habitats in the landscape, and if you don't have those surrounding it, those native bees won't be able to colonize a new restoration, for example. And so this is really important for figuring things out because we want to know where to invest, right? And so do you need, for example, lots of natural habitat to really support native bees to colonize that area? Or can they fly really far away and we don't need to worry so much about how the landscape is surrounding that? Another aspect is, do we need to care a lot about what the local habitat, what the local structure is? Is the food important, the local flower community, the local habitat, the nesting ecology? And so this is really important because it informs us, what do we plant? What seeds do we plant? How do we, those sorts of questions. And then how do we end up managing that to kind of maximize that? And so, again, we're interested in how do we most effectively build restorations for native wild bees. So I'm going to talk about some research now that we've done in the lab in the past few years and finish up with a big project that we're still getting some of the data in and finishing up. But the first one I want to talk about is some work that was done by a grad student in my lab, Ian Lane. And he wanted to get at this question of how good are restorations for bees. And so he looked at a bunch of different he wanted to look at this landscape. So like, what is the type of habitat that's surrounding the restorations? And then what is the local floral community and how might that affect bee communities? So he went out and found sites all throughout southwest Minnesota and western Minnesota. And what he has here, this figure is just that we have site on the x-axis below, and the y-axis is the amount of agriculture surrounding that site. And the big question is, if you have a lot of agriculture around a restoration, maybe bees won't use that site very well. And so he just found sites with you can see on the far left that had very little agriculture and other sites that had a lot of agriculture. So I should mention that y-axis is just the amount of agriculture at a 1,500 meter radius that has agriculture in it, a restoration that has agriculture surrounding it, right? And so some sites had a lot of agriculture, 80-some percent, 90%, and some sites had only a little bit of agriculture. He also did a really nice job with his field crew looking at the local floral community. So how many flowers were in each restoration? And so what did he end up finding? Well, we see here from this figure on the x-axis, we have that proportion of agriculture ranging from about 5 to 10% to up to 90% within a 1.5 kilometers. And in the y-axis is it's a weird number, but it's just the number of bee species we can kind of think of it as. And so what we can see here is that there's a lot of scatter. And so that the landscape surrounding, the amount of agriculture surrounding the restorations doesn't seem to influence the number of bee species that are there. However, when he looked at the local community, so now on the x-axis we have the number of different flower species that are there, and on the y-axis we have the same thing, the number of different bee species. We see here that in fact there is an increase in the number of bee species if you put more flowers in that local landscape. And so this is really, I think, a very hopeful message, right? And so the reason for that is that the local flower community is more important than the agriculture surrounding the site. And so this actually tells us that, gives us some bit of evidence, and I'm going to keep on kind of coming back to this, but gives us some evidence that we can put pollinator habitat in potentially in different areas if we really get the flower community doing well. Another student of mine, Maya Kalangara, did a nice job looking at conservation reserve programs, so CRP different sites. And she looked at two different things, looked at different quality of CRP mixes. So this is wanted to look a little more detail at some of these questions about local floral communities. And so she looked at CRP that was kind of labeled as what we would think of from a bee perspective, maybe as low quality, didn't have as many flowering species in it, but it still had flowers in it, and compared that to high quality conservation reserve program. And so these were different kind of ways. And one of the things we think of here is this cost of the seed mix. So we have inexpensive seed mixes, and these are different conservation reserve practices. And then we have kind of an expensive seed mixes. And really what she was trying to get at this question is, do more expensive seed mixes, do we need to spend a lot more money to make more diverse and abundant? And she just looked at bumblebee communities here. She also looked at butterflies, but I'm not going to talk about the butterflies today. So like, question is basically, if you spend a lot more money on the seed mix, do you get more bang for your buck, is kind of what she was looking at. And she ended up comparing these low quality, what we think of as low quality, at least, CRP mixes to high quality CRP mixes. And then she also compared those to actual remnant prairie sites, which is kind of the gold standard. And so here's some data from what she found. And if we look at the first leftmost graph, what we see on the x-axis is different qualities of habitat. So low quality CRP, high quality CRP, and remnant prairies. And then on the y-axis, on the top one, we have the number of bumblebees. Bombus is the genus for bumblebee. And then we have the bombus richness. That's just the number of species of bumblebees. And what we see here is that we see a little more in terms of a few more bumblebees in the remnant prairies compared to the CRP, but not much. It wasn't statistically significant. And we see a few more species in that remnant prairie, but not much. Again, it wasn't statistically significant. So what this tells us is that habitat, that the different CRP mixes are both actually doing pretty well for supporting native bees. But what you did find, if you look at this one, which is kind of, again, I'm going to hammer this point again and again. We have on the x-axis now, we have just the number of flowers. We use a metric called floral area here, and the number of flowers. And we actually do, and what she did find is that as you get more flowers, you get more bees. Flowers and bees are just so tightly linked. And so Maya's just finishing up this research. Hopefully she's going to defend her thesis here pretty quick. But there's some kind of interesting work that looks at kind of the local community. All right. So what I want to move on to now is I want to talk a bit about this project that we did that kind of ties all of this together. And we call this the MAP project. We have a lot of projects, so we have to have acronyms in our lab to kind of go through these different pieces. And this is called the MAP project because we call it the Minnesota Agriculture for Pollinators program. And it was funded by the state of Minnesota as well as United States Department of Agriculture. And the ideas behind this and the things we really wanted to test is we want to test some more of these ideas a little more rigorously than we have and others have in the past. And one of the ideas we're testing here in terms of is this kind of idea of the Goldilocks hypothesis for where do we put habitat. So it comes back to this question of landscape again. Where might we put a different habitat? And on the X, this is just a way to think about it here. So this is an actual data. On the X-axis down below, we have kind of far to the left, we would have kind of poor landscapes. This might be from a bee perspective, at least, right? So you can imagine like a big, huge parking lot in downtown Minneapolis or something like that. There's no resources for bees, and versus really good landscapes on the right that we end up having lots of flowers, lots of habitat, lots of nesting resources and things like that. And in the y-axis, we want to look at things like, what is your return on investment? Not just like the number of bees you get or things like that, but your return on investment. And so the idea here is that if you, in really poor landscapes, right, there's no reason to put maybe some bee habitat there because there's no bees around, no native bees, at least no native bees around. You're not going to, it's a waste of money. Why put your money there? There's nothing there that's going to colonize and kind of support it. On the other end, there in these good landscapes, if you want to put just more good habitat where there's already lots of good habitat, well, that's not going to be big return on your investment either, because there's already so much good habitat there. It's not really worth that, right? And then what we have in the middle, this is why you called it the Goldilocks one. The idea is that that kind of the middle level where you have kind of some good natural habitat, but some kind of poor habitat from a bee's perspective kind of in the mix is maybe the best place to put that. So what did we end up to do that? So one of the things we really wanted to do with this project is we wanted to do it ourselves, do all of the installation of habitat, really control a lot of this. And so we launched a big project to do this. So what we did is we actually found a bunch of habitats where we put our own pollinator plantings in different habitats. So we had areas that were that had low amount of natural habitat surrounding them. So about 1 to 9% with about a kilometer surrounding a pollinator planting or restoration. We put a bunch of habitats in areas that were medium natural habitat, and then we put other pollinator plantings in high natural. There was lots of high natural habitat. So we had these different pollinator plantings in different types of surrounding habitat. The other thing we did is we actually wanted to look at, and this is a big question we get from landowners a lot, is like, how big do these plantings need to be? So we did kind of a small plantings. These plantings were about 2 acres in size. And then we did some large plantings, and these were about 11 acres in size. So we have different sizes of habitat, and we have placed in different kind of habitat contexts. And then the third thing we managed was we looked at different seed mixes. So one mix is what we call kind of this diverse mix. It's relatively expensive. It's about 40 different forb species. So it can be kind of costly, but it's really, we think it's really good for a lot of native bees. And then we had kind of this simple, inexpensive mix. And these were just a few species of clover, for example. It's very inexpensive. It did produce flowers over the whole blooming season for native bees. But it's just kind of it's a much cheaper mix. And that mix, is about 1/8 the cost. So we spent of all the acres we put in, we bought about $64,000 worth of diverse expensive seed, and we spent about $8,000 on this simple inexpensive mix. And pretty obvious, you can tell here that if it's a cheaper mix, you can do a lot more conservation, a lot more habitat. But if it's not very good, then you want to be very careful about that, right? And I just want to highlight some work. I think Pete Berthelsen at the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund really helped us kind of develop these mixes. He does a lot of great work if you're really interested in getting some habitat on some farmland. He's great to work with. He works a lot with growers in terms of getting some of this habitat back in, and has funding and other sorts of things. So a great contact. So all in all, in this project, this was really a ton of work. We had plots that were what in science we call a fully factorial design. So we had all different habitats, all different surrounding landscapes. We had different sizes, and we had different seed mixes in these plots. And that's why we needed lots of funding for the work. The work was done in Southwest Minnesota. This is just different. We kind of chose the area in the Southwest, kind of keep us we kind of restricted it to these different sites, these different counties, that you see kind of on the area that's out there, and just to kind of keep things consistent. And we had so much great input. We worked with the Corn and Soy Growers Association. I did a lot of reaching out, and we needed about 40 sites, and we had, I think, 170 farmers and growers come forth to wanted to participate in the program. So we had just such a great. This is just got me so excited to really work with all these great growers on this to get habitat into their farms. And all the habitat we put in was in previously land that was in previous production. Most of it was soy production so that had been in soy the year before, some corn production, but this has all been previously, all the habitat that we put in had been done that way. And we paid farmers a rental fee that was at least matched Conservation Reserve Program funding. So we have all how much that cost. And then we worked with an agency to actually implement and put in these different habitat plantings. And if we just kind of zoom out here, that we see here, the different kind of plots. So we see here that we have small sites, large sites, and the honeybee and native bee, I just should mention, the honeybee mix is the cheaper mix that we think is really good for honeybees. The native bee mix is the more expensive mix, is what we ended up putting out there. So what did we end up finding? So we did a lot of, we measured a lot of different things on there. One of the things we did is that, and I'll talk a little bit, one of the things we did here is we looked at native bees. So we went out and sampled native bees. We collected about 25,000 different specimens, individual bees, and we got about 163 different species. And so what did we find here? So this is these figures here, I'll walk you through them again. A lot of figures today. On the x-axis, we have HB, and that stands for the honeybee mix, and that's the cheaper mix. And the NM is the native mix. And we see that represented in both graphs there. And on the y-axis, we have the number of different specimens, or like the abundance of bees on figure A. And then figure B there, we have the diversity, which is the number of different species. We can think of it as a way to, we can think about how many different kinds of bees are there, is a way to kind of think of that. And what we see here is that that there really was no effective seed mix on bee diversity and bee abundance. And so this is really, again, another hopeful message. And also, I don't have the figure for this, but the landscape piece, we didn't find ineffective either. And so what this tells us is that these habitats can be these pollinator plantings can be done cheaply in lots of different areas, in lots of different landscapes, and be very effective for supporting native bees. One of the things we did find is it takes some time. So if you put in these habitats, here on the x-axis now we have year of when the study was when the measurements were taken, when the bees were collected. On the y-axis we have our bee abundance and bee diversity again. And so it does take some time. So we get, you can imagine if you take a place that has been in corn and soy production and you put that into pollinator habitat in the first year, it's not, the flowers aren't growing very well, the bees aren't coming into the plot, it kind of looks a little junky, but after a while those habitats actually get very effective and the bees actually come in. So this is some work we've done, and it's actually been published now. It says in review, but a postdoc in my lab has really done some nice work getting a lot of this together. So in addition to that, this is kind of a little bit of this is going to switch out of native bees a little bit, because this is a big project and we wanted to look at a lot of different aspects and not just measure native bees and how native bees did in this. And so we looked at things like crop pests. We worked with Bob Cook. Maybe some of you know Bob. Bob is in addition to being our department head in the Department of Entomology here, he is also a soybean entomologist. So we worked with him to look at crop pests in soy, and also the natural enemies, so the things that eat the crop pests, so the predators that eat the crop pests. We did some work on honeybees with Katie Lee and Marla Spivak, and then we looked at bumblebee reproduction as well. And I'm just going to really briefly touch on some of the work we did with Bob, and this is some work that we're ongoing and trying to work to finalize some of the data analysis. So this is very preliminary, I want to say. So what we did here is we did a bunch of natural enemy and pest. I should put on this top figure here, sampling. So this is a picture of us in soy. On the left there, we would go and take a sweep net and run that sweep net through a bean field. And then we'd also run it through the pollinator planting, which you see there on the right. And actually what was kind of cool, what we did is we looked at different locations. So if you look at that picture there on the left, there is the white kind of polygon there, the white line, that is actually where the pollinator planting is. And so we did a sweep netting in that pollinator planting. And then what we did is we went a little bit into the bean field, and we did sweep netting there as well. And so the idea is we wanted to see whether like pests or predators were spilling over into that habitat. Right. So this is one of the reasons why some people might want to put in some of this habitat. You can actually increase the number of predators that are into that area. But we're also wanted to know whether we don't want to also increase pests that are in that area as well. So we sweep netted that, and then we went into kind of the middle of the field, we went actually at 100 meters into the field to see if that spillover of pests or predators was happening. And then as a kind of control, as a check, we went and looked at the far field, the far field to kind of look at that. So this is something that's very far from the pollinator habitat. And we did this only in bean fields. We didn't do any of this in corn, just to kind of keep things consistent. And so what we have here on, this is, again, some very preliminary data, is that looking at pests, and we removed this, the plant bugs from this because they were just so abundant, it kind of made the data a little bit tricky to look at. And on the y-axis, we have the number of pests that were caught, and on the x-axis, we have the number of pests that were caught. On the y-axis, we have the different locations, and that corresponds to that figure there on the left. And what we see is that for pests, we see we see more pests in that far edge, and it may be due to something that's going on, but at least we don't see the pests coming in and spilling over from the plot into the near edge. And so maybe there's some control going on there. We don't know for sure. The one thing I don't have the data for right now, but I have the data for, but we haven't finished the analysis, is we've actually done some more specific looking at soybean aphid, which is actually the big problem, as you know, in soybeans. So we'll be looking at those data. And I just removed the plant bug, as I mentioned, because they're so abundant kind of everywhere. It was a little bit tricky to see much signal with them. We also looked at predator species, so these are the natural enemies, the things that eat the crop pests. And again, the same thing, and we found a lot of them in the plot. We didn't see a ton of spillover into that near edge area. That being said, this is all predatory species, so we're kind of looking at certain ones and trying to kind of dissect some of this and seeing whether there might be some that are benefiting from this. So that's kind of another area we looked at. And finally, the one thing I'll just mention is that we were very interested. One of the big questions we get a lot in terms of pollinator plantings is what about some of the pesticides, some of the insecticides that go in there? And so we wanted to look at whether neonicotinoids were there and whether there is residual in the soil, right? So if you have a plot and it's got a bunch of insecticides, well, that doesn't work too well for the bees. And so there's a big interest to know how that might be affecting. So what we did is we did a bunch of soil samples in our pollinator plantings. And we also looked at whether the neonics had come into the plant samples as well, because that's where the bees are going to really come into contact with that. And we found basically almost no neonics, some a little bit in the soil, but hardly any neonics in the soil, even though these had been in conventional ag. This isn't organic ag or anything like that. So we didn't find hardly any neonics in the soil and none in any of the plantings. So this is to me, a pretty hopeful thing, that I think that these plantings do seem to work even in areas that had been in kind of conventional production. Okay, so with that, just some kind of takeaways. I know I kind of covered a lot of ground from bees in the time of T-Rex to habitat in Minnesota. So a couple kind of key takeaways is that flowers are really, really key in here. Again, flowers and bees are just so tightly linked to one another. And we see again and again that the number of flowers that you get in the landscape, the better it is for bees. And in fact, we think, based upon a number of different studies that we've been looking at, is the flower abundance is more important than the surrounding landscape. So flowers are really key. And less expensive mixes can be quite effective. Some of the work I didn't show, there's so many species of bees. We're starting to dig into different species and different groups of bees. Some of them might have a lot of different needs. But from a general bee conservation perspective, we think that these inexpensive mixes can in fact be pretty effective. And then finally, habitat can increase natural enemies, but there's kind of some uncertainty about some of the benefits in terms of whether there's spillover and how that affects pests. And we're going to kind of continue to get at that with some of our data as we kind of keep on parsing through it. So with that, I want to thank my lab group. So I know there was a couple pictures of me doing work in the field, but sadly I don't get out much. My lab group is really the one who does all this great work. I have got a bunch of really smart, very dedicated young scientists in the lab that are just really, I think, moving us forward and doing really cool work. Really want to thank especially for the MAP project that I outlined. Such great support from a lot of the growers and different folks there, so that this work would not be possible without them, and so thankful to that. And of course, thankful to all our funding partners for help making this work possible, and then all the partners that we've worked with in terms of helping us get things kind of together and think about things. And then finally, I really want to thank you all for spending a bit of your morning with me learning about bees and bees in Minnesota. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. I am left feeling like there's a lot of potential for, helping and supporting pollinator insects in our agricultural and rural landscapes. And we have a lot of questions here. So
Okay,
some
good.
in the Q&A and
I'll
some
see
in
if I can
chat.
answer them. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're going to try to go through this. I'm going to summarize a few of them, kind of combine them together. There's this general wondering if cover crops and cash crops, have the potential to support our native bees too. And I'm going to chime in with a quick answer, and I'd like to hear more from you, Dan. But yes, cover crops can support or, provide resources for our bees, but they do have to reach the part where they're flowering. And a lot of often, I think my experience with cover crops is that we're not leaving them long enough to flower in many cases if we're using them as like a traditional cover crop. So some things like the clovers, there's various clovers, crimson clover, balanza, a few others. Hairy vetch can flower, buckwheat, but again, we'd have to leave them in the field long enough to reach that flowering point. And then as far as our cash crops, they will utilize alfalfa and soybeans even. And there's actually several studies, more than one study, that has shown some increased yields, at least with honeybees utilizing soybeans. And, people say, Claire, soybeans are self-pollinating. Yes, they are. They don't require cross-pollination from an insect, but having insects present to help move that pollen more can increase yield. And even there's been some studies that show getting pollen from other soybeans. So like getting some different pollen can help increase yield too. So long way of saying that our crops and cash crops and cover crops can support pollinators. Do you have anything to add to that, Dan?
Yeah, a few things. That's a great summary. I agree with all of that. A couple things I'll say about cover crops. I will say that if we can get some of those to go in the spring, some of the spring bees are the bees we're concerned about from a conservation point of view. So that could really be beneficial even if we get into some of the spring crops. So one of the things that we don't have a lot in our pollinator plantings is good spring blooming plants, and we need to get more in there. So if you can get these cover crops to last a little bit longer than that, I think that'd be great. Claire's totally right about the soybeans. There is some evidence. They definitely will use soybeans. How beneficial it is uncertain, but they definitely use it. And yeah, there is some evidence that we get increase in pollination. In particular, we get I think some of that work it depends a little bit on variety, is my understanding, and so I think needs to be some more work on the potential benefits to soybeans with that. But bees are even known to use corn at times too. There's evidence of some corn pollen as well. So yeah, there can be some use there. And alfalfa is great. I mean, alfalfa is really good there and I know canola isn't so much here, but things like that can be really beneficial. But yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, there's just a lot of questions, but one that kind of goes along with that, and maybe Liz and Anthony, you can chime in on this question, is, are cover crop seeds typically treated? I guess, the concern there would be that if it has a neonicotinoid seed treatment and you're using it specifically to support pollinators, are you doing some harm?
Typically,
I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I would say
I'm not sure.
Yeah, sorry, this is just Liz. I would say most
Yep.
cover crops would not be treated with a neonic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean you might have some legumes that are treated with something else, but not a neonic. Yeah.
That would be my impression too, from my experience with cover crop seed. Um, all right. I'm trying to pick some pertinent ones here because I know we're running out of time. This might be good for the group to know. Dan, is what times of the growing season are bees collecting pollen and nectar?
They're collecting pollen and nectar the entire growing season. I mean, if honeybees in particular, it's interesting. So most all native bees are like annual plants. The whole colony dies off every year. But honeybees, for example, they just when it gets warm, they just go. But other bees, there's always if there's a flower out, there's a bee out. And so some of these solitary bees, as adults, they'll live for 2 weeks. Some of them, and then other things like bumblebees, the queens will emerge in April and the colony will get going all year and then they'll die out in September. So pretty much there's always bees around. The biggest time for diversity and abundance is July. So that's when basically you'll see nobody in the lab at that time. We're desperately out in the field. So July in Minnesota is really the time where we get the most abundance and diversity of bees. But in reality, bees are out whenever there's flowers out.
Thank you. Yeah, there's some mentions that winter camelina as a cash crop, has flowers in late May to early June. So that has this person shared that they observe a lot of bumblebees using that.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a few questions about kind of the ground dwelling bees and how to support those in cultivated fields, and then another question kind of like, what about tillage? Do bees benefit from reduced tillage or changing the timing of tillage? What are your thoughts on those ground nesting natives?
Yeah, I think tillage would pretty much they wouldn't work with any tillage. So I don't think you get any sort of because if you think of a bee that emerges and she gets her colony or her eggs going, that egg needs to sit in that ground for a year. So tillage will basically kind of kill off any bees that are nesting in the soil, and reduced tillage does seem to show some benefit. But bees can kind of nest in a lot of different places. So I think there's lots of different habitat that they can be. But yeah, so it kind of doesn't work with tillage per se with a lot of bees. Yeah.
So maybe, if a farmer relies on tillage in their crop field, perhaps trying to keep other areas on the farm or nearby.
Exactly. Yep.
To support those ground nesting
exactly.
bees. Yeah. And I have a couple of questions specifically about your research that came in. So I think it's good that we define this. There was a question about what's the difference between a pest and a predator in that part that Bob Cook helped with. And are the pests crop pests or what? Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry about that. Sorry if I wasn't clear. Pests are things that we don't like in a general sense, right? So that's what I always think of it as. And in this case, and then sorry for that language if that was unclear. I think a pest, by that I mean crop pests. So things that are eating the crops is basically what we're looking at. Of course, pests could be a disease, or a pest could be a invasive plant. And the predator in this case is something that eats another animal. And so we think of predators, as natural enemies, or beneficials is another term that we would use in the entomological world. So do we have beneficials? And to me, the predators are the things that have at least the potential to eat some of the crop pests, some of the animals, some of the herbivores that are eating the crops. So that's what that's the definition there. Yeah.
And so those would be like lady beetles and ground beetles and
lacewings and Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad we talked about it there. I think maybe part of the confusion was because when you were talking earlier about some bees that parasitize or are kind of pests to other bees. So
exactly. Yeah, those are
different. Different. And then somebody asked and mentions that the research looked at 2 acres as the small size of habitat. do you have a feel for the minimum size that could provide benefit? As in, can smaller habitat areas still be beneficial?
I don't have a number, but yeah, smaller habitat can be really beneficial. So if you remember, I had a lot of slides up, but I had a Zach Portman taxonomist in our lab, and he had that tiny bee on his finger. That bee doesn't need a huge area to persist, right? And so your backyard garden or your front yard garden could be enough for that bee, for example. And then just putting some habitat out on the ground is always beneficial, right? It's so you're always going to benefit at some level because there's resources there. Whether your front garden isn't going to support an entire bumblebee colony, but it can be an important component of that bumblebee colony. So I mean, you can get quite small and be really, really beneficial. Yeah.
I recall hearing Marla Spivak saying that a lot too, is that don't worry about size, just get flowers out there.
I
right?
agree with that. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, 100%.
And then there was a request that you share the published paper, Chase
Sure.
et al., so we can put that in our resource document that
For
will
sure.
be shared at the end. And this kind of goes with that last question, I guess. Any thoughts on spreading out the pollinator habitat versus all of the area in one location?
That's a really good question.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'm going to say that I would think whatever's easiest for you to do, I would do that. I think there's a practicality piece of managing and implementing, right? So if you have lots of different spots, it's actually really tricky to put them in, to maybe manage that. So we didn't find big effects. So I don't know. It's a bit of, I'm waffling here because I'm not totally sure. Bees are pretty mobile. They can fly around pretty well. So, I mean, I don't think it's a big deal for them to move around some different spots. So I think I would leave it up to the practicality question of what's most practical for you. What do you want it to look like? What might be aesthetically pleasing? And I think as long as you're getting the habitat in there, I think you're pretty good.
All right. Thank you. Yeah. And there was a question and comment kind of in the chat about whether these practices can kind of dovetail with regenerative ag and kind of the trend in sustainable agriculture. And the question in there was really about funding to help establish and manage these plantings. And I will just say, let's not address that right now, Dan. I put a bunch of funding sources in our resource sheet, and you can add some more too of entities that can help with that funding, but there are entities out there. I wanted to get to the question of the typical flying range of the bees you study, and just kind of an interesting one of somebody commenting that a bumblebee's weight is too heavy for its wings to support, so how do bumblebees fly? So if you can answer both of those.
Yeah, so well, I mean, bumblebees just have incredibly strong muscles, and they're a lot lighter than you think. So they don't. I don't know. They have no trouble flying, and they can carry a lot. But it is an important piece about bees will actually dry out their nectar to transport, because I mean, flight is an energetically costly thing to end up doing. But the flight range of bees really varies a lot. So honeybees can fly a couple miles, but some of the smaller bees will fly maybe 50 yards. And so we can kind of we've done some equations on this, and we measure basically their shoulders, and the shoulders are how big their shoulders are is a measurement of how much wing muscle they have. And so we can actually get a good idea of how far they fly. And I want to say there's two different pieces of this. One I talked about is colonization. And so that's like, you can imagine you're going to get up and move and find a new place to live. Well, that's going to be a lot longer. That might be a lot longer flight. You might use wind and other things to do that. But if a bee is like a central place forager, like a bird, or like us, we have a home and then we go out and get our food, we bring it back. We go out and get our food and bring it back. So in that case, a bee doesn't want to, like any of us, don't want to energetically go to Cub Foods that are 20 miles away. We want to go to the Cub Food that's a mile away. And so having that close resource, but they can go back and forth, like as I mentioned, honeybees for a couple miles and bumblebees as well. And some of the smaller bees might be 50 to 100 yards.
Yeah, thank you. We are out of time. So there are a couple of questions that are really about particular plant species and some tips on timing and soil prep. And so we will try to include those in our resource sheet. I think are some places that you can do some, educating yourself on species and steps. And we'll try to address any of the other questions too that got left unasked here. Unless, Dan, you have anything that you learned from your study about tips and timing and soil prep for planting those areas, especially in those former crop fields.
Yeah, typically what we did at the best way to do a lot of that is we use Roundup Ready soy. You want to make sure to get the weeds really controlled. Weeds are a big issue. One of the things I didn't talk about is the success of these restorations from the plant angle. I kind of glossed over that. That's actually a big question that we're trying to deal with right now, because we did get a lot of variation in success, and we're trying to figure out what that is. We didn't set up our study to test that. So we don't have great, strong evidence for it. But yeah, we typically plant these things in the winter. And we did it in our case, and we seemed it works pretty well as broadcast seeding in the winter. The best thing you can get is if you get you get it on the snow, and then you get kind of a warm day and the seeds kind of melt into that snow really good. And then that's the most effective thing that we have found to actually get these things planted.
Did you do any tillage prior to the planting? Or did the farmers do any special?
No tillage prior to the planting. But I mean, as I mentioned, these were all in production plots, so they had been tilled, when they put the soy in or something. They put the beans in. So, yeah.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you. And as I said, we will try to address some of these questions or put resources around them in our resource sheet here. Several people are saying thank you, Dan, for your presentation.
Yeah, well, thank you for your time. Yeah.
And I want to thank you all for joining us here today, and thank again our generous sponsors of the Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council and the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council. And want to give you a reminder that next week's session is going to focus on forecasting tools for crop and pest management. And so staying on kind of the insect theme. And we will have our CEUs available here. And thank you, and we'll hopefully see you all next week.